Wizards needs to start having like a little public service announcement, like a card when you open a pack that's like, you wouldn't steal a card. And it's like opens up like like an FBI warning to a DVD.
Distraction makers.
Proxies are a complicated subject, seriously.
We've talking about this subject for a while now.
It's tough to talk about because we make games. Let's talk about the argument for proxies and the argument against proxies, right? I think the main argument for proxies is card accessibility, right? And there are some of these cards that are just completely unaccessible for most people. And if you're not allowing proxies, you're just allowing people to play the cards if they have the cards, you're either giving an advantage to people who've been playing the game a very long time. That would be an advantage that other players could never bridge the gap on, or people that have a lot of money to spend on the game.
You're looking at I think accessibility cards from two different points, right? You're looking at it from either I'm going to spend a lot of money on the game, or I could just print all the best cards. Somewhere in the middle is someone that just maybe can't spend as much money as other people and isn't willing to print cards. Basically, it ends up creating this sort of ecosystem where the person that is in your group that is able to spend the most amount of money on cards is going to have the highest access to the best cards, meaning that they're going to have the better decks, meaning that they are probably going to win more often.
Yeah, it's almost like I don't even want to say it's the best kept secret of trading card games, but one way that you solve the queen problem in trading card games, the queen problem being that like if your game pieces are customizable the way that a trading card game's game pieces are, what's stopping people from choosing all queens, right? Mana cost is one of those things. The fact that your deck is limited to 4 copies of a card is another thing. And the secret one is cost. Is that there's a market at work that makes sure that not everyone has access to the most powerful cards because they either cannot or are not willing to spend the money on them. And so this situation that you're describing is, okay, well, you have maybe one player in your commander group or whatever who can just spend infinite money on Magic cards for whatever reason. And then they just have all the best cards that they could want. And it does have a substantial impact on the power of their decks. And so one solution might be, well, if they're going to spend all the money, why don't you just go ahead and let other people proxy that don't want to spend the money so everybody's kind of on an even playing field. The flip side of this queen problem thing of money spent on or not spending any money in proxying everything is that you boost your play group or your deck specifically into a much higher power level. So if no one in your group is really spending a lot of money on cards, you're kind of at the similar budget level, and then you start proxying very expensive cards. Now you're in that sort of scenario that we're describing of somebody who's spending infinite money.
Right.
You're just not spending any of it. There's no resistance.
I think that's the thing, is that it both exist on this sort of general spectrum, right? And it's a bit of a circle where it's like there's the people in the middle. It's the people in the center that are just spending an average amount, whatever that is considered, an average amount of money on their cards to create their decks. Then there's the people that are deciding to spend a lot of money. And then there's the people that are saying, well, I don't really want to spend money, but I'm going to print all the best cards. Right. And you can have a certain level of control on either end, right? Someone can spend an extra 100, extra 200, etc. Someone can print some of the best cards, all the best cards, and keep going. But eventually that circle is going to go all the way and connect to where the person that's spending all of the money and the person that is printing all of the best cards are just going to have the best decks.
The best stuff. Yeah. Which honestly, I think that is part of there's kind of a life cycle to play groups in this way, right? Like after a while, unless you actively try to tamp it down, you're going to have a bit of an arms race that happens, and eventually you probably get to the point where you're like, oh, we're playing CEDH decks, and then you're like, we're not really having a great time. Let's take the power level down. And proxying plays a role in that.
Over time, you just end up sort of pushing that power level further and further and further because there's no barrier to entry. Right? You don't have to go and spend all that money. Technically, yes, that is what can happen. The same can happen with people spending a lot of money. But for some reason, there's that concept of spending money that a lot of people have sort of had as this cultural acceptance as like, well, that's the okay slope to go down, is like, it's okay if I spent a lot of money. But in both of these cases, whether someone is proxying or whether someone is spending a lot of money, it's up to both those players to make sure that they have some sort of constraints on their deck construction, right? In order to make, especially in a commander pod, right? Specifically Commander.
Well, and this gets into the thing that we're talking about a lot, which is like there's norms in Commander and there's rules. There are no rules that say you can't just build a CEDH deck, right? There's a norm that says you shouldn't maybe do that to people that are playing decks in lower brackets or whatever, but you know, your norm is that we're all trying to have a good time.
It's a similar argument that people make for like, tutors aren't boring, your deck is boring. And it's like, well, tutors are boring if you play them at their highest level of optimization, right? They're very consistent. You're going to go for the same line of play every single time, pretty much. Boring is subjective. So I'm sorry, I'm not trying to be I'm being hyperbolic about using that phrase, but it's essentially going for the same line of play every single time that you play it. However, you can use tutors in a suboptimal way, but that is up to the player to move their deck into a suboptimal position, right? Playing a tutor not to go and get a Thassa's Oracle and Demonic Consultation, but using a tutor to go and get some silly crazy card.
And proxies, are kind of similar, right? Yeah. Like you can proxy a deck that, I don't know, maybe should have you want to have a pretty good land base because the deck concept itself is a little fuzzy. Like I don't know if this is really going to hold its own if it's going up against stuff that's a bit more optimized. So I want to make sure that I can at least get my lands into play and do the thing before the game's over or whatever.
It's the power level discussion, right? Of everyone's deck is a 7 or trying to organize people's decks into these different power levels. And the thing is that like if you're not talking about CEDH is the top 1% of all decks, right? And then everything below that is the 99% of mediocre to bad decks. And your deck exists ambiguously somewhere in that 99%. Even the brackets don't fix this. You could remove any game changers, right? Functionally even have like a bracket 1 deck or whatever. And that deck could still be like in the top 70% of decks, maybe. I don't know. And you won't know because you have to play that deck hundreds to thousands of times to know if it's actually competitively viable or not. And so this idea of like, oh, well, I'm going to have some of these lands be in my deck because I'm trying to balance it out because I think that I need a better land base or something for my plan, like you were saying. Like, I think that that's perfectly fine if you have a decent sense for, what your deck can do, but it's always going to be ambiguous, right? And it is sort of this implicit general norm, I suppose, that Commander players are trying to live with, but without any sort of real structure.
A lot of what we've been talking about has been specifically about sort of the gameplay implications of proxies, and we haven't really touched on the sort of monetary aspect and impact that it can either have on game stores or on Wizards of the Coast themselves, on the actual game. I think game stores probably have a bigger argument here in terms of like monetary impact. If like singles are, you're not buying singles at the store, like how are you sort of like helping to support that ecosystem if like you are participating in going to a game store to play your games? There's still plenty of other stuff you can buy to support the store. And theoretically, like you if you weren't proxying, you might not even be at the store. So there's kind of this interesting argument. There's a bit of a tangent, but in the early days of sort of music piracy with Napster and things, we had a huge blow up from the band The Offspring and the band Metallica. They were both on different sides of this issue. And The Offspring's argument was, we don't really care if people want to download all of our music. We're not really getting paid for that stuff anyway. The record companies are making all the money off of the CD sales and things. We just want people to listen to our music and come to our concerts because concerts are basically where they were making their money. And they're basically, their thought process was the more people that listen to our music, the better, because then the more people come to our concerts. And Metallica, on the other hand, was on the opposite side of this because they're making money off of they had like a better contract deal. So they were making money off the records and making money off of the shows. And they're sitting here going like, you're stealing from us. And proxies are kind of similar, right? Like they're in this weird gray area of, well, you really want as many people to be playing the game as possible, right? Because that leads to maybe them bringing in other people into the game that do spend money on the game, or being at events, being at the game store, playing the game, and sort of adding to kind of the ecosystem of people playing the game. I don't know which side the like proxies ultimately fall on, because proxies or cards themselves are the avenue for revenue for a lot of game makers. And this is a bit from a game designer's perspective, is that I'm sort of like, I think ideally you would make it so that as many people that want to play your game can play the game as possible. But if your primary path to revenue is through the cards, selling the cards themselves, and players are sort of choosing to just print them off, I think that there's probably a model there, and it's something that I plan to explore, is figure out like, okay, well, how do you just get cards into players' hands? Because especially as an indie designer, it's like that's your biggest hurdle, is just getting people to play the game. And then like, well, the people that then do want to spend money, how do you encourage that? How do you create opportunities for players that do want to spend money to spend money on the game?
Basically being open about proxies, right? Like, let's say you start a game and you say, okay, 100% you can proxy all the cards, and here's even the cards, you can go and print and play them or whatever. That's essentially just a really aggressive strategy to get people to play the game. And if we were to maybe compare this as close as possible to like an existing game model, we did a video on Legends of Runeterra back in the day where we discussed like one of the potential pitfalls that the game had, and what led to its sort of maintenance mode that it's existing in now, is they had a very aggressive, very generous model to get cards into players' hands. And it came from a good place in that they really wanted players to be able to have access to this card collection so that they could participate in the newest meta, and all that's great. The problem is that if it's so generous, right, and like you said, that's the majority of where their costs are, or how they're going to make their money, you need something else for the players to get. In their case, it was cosmetic items. And it seems like that just wasn't enough to keep up what the costs were to actually maintain the overall game.
Well, and there was another problem too. There's this queen problem again, right? Where like secretly, like spending money on the game slows the distribution of cards into the player base. And if you're instead just going like, well, here you go, print them off and you can play whatever you want, you're eliminating that bit of resistance to that progression in building your collection, right? This is also a problem with like expandable card games, living card games, versus a TCG model. Is like it is really weird. It's kind of almost like a weird hiccup, I guess, in capitalism / TCG lineup, in that these two things happen to be as synergistic as they are. It's really easy, and I think in some ways we're seeing Magic end up kind of leaning into it a bit, that these two things line up in the way that they do. In that card distribution, the way that a TCG does it elongates player lifespan, like player life churn cycles. And so, you know, if you're making a game and you're just like, okay, well, you can proxy all the cards, here's all the cards. You're sort of, you almost need to come up with a different way to add in what we call like a system of entropy, or a way to sort of slow players' optimization cycles down. You almost need to come up with an alternative.
Indie designers probably don't need to concern themselves as much with that, just because Magic has such a large player base that more games are being played, meaning you're going to get to those answers faster. If you have less players, less games, less access to that data online because of different databases that players are constructing or whatever, then yeah, it's going to take longer for that sort of meta to develop. But it is still going, it's like, if you're looking at it from the most extreme case, right, then yeah, that is a concern, right, and has to be thought about early on.
I also think, so there's another business model part of this, which this comes from Brandon Sanderson, which is he's a author, for people that don't know.
I think a lot of people know who Brandon Sanderson is.
You never know.
You're right.
He sort of has talked fairly recently about the fact that like paperback book sales are almost like a break even. They're almost like a loss leader at this point. And he ends up making a lot of his money in like special editions, like things that are really honing in on the people that, you know, are super fans and want this sort of these extra experiences and like these like artifacts basically. And I think that the same might end up being true for sort of a TCG model, right? In that if your paperback is just your baseline cards, or even a digital version of your game that people can play for free or whatever, and then your higher end players are going to want those special treatments and, you know, accessories and things that are make the game more special for them as like a bigger fan of the game.
Yeah, and I think that it's funny because that, you know, that going back to Legends of Runeterra might have been their overall intention. And I think that with their case, large AAA game company like Riot, their overhead might have just been too much to be able to make up for that, basically.
Yeah.
But with indie designers,
I think digital is also different than paper, right? Like physical items, I think are substantially different.
I mean, yeah, I think this is actually why Riftbound is going to be a physical game, is because I think that they saw that the collectability means that players will want to continue buying cards for secondary market purposes, right? Once you have a full collection of Legend of Runeterra, there's no reason for you to go and buy more cards. This is like business side of games, but this is why I think that we have a bit of like
weird additional insight maybe into
this
topic.
It's difficult because I think it's easy to take that like overly generous side and be like, well, no, I want to give this to the players. But unfortunately, I don't think we have enough data on hand to know, like, is it actually more beneficial to be overly generous, or is it actually beneficial to be very restrictive and say, no, you have to have this sort of minimum buy-in to experience this?
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, we have a lot of different products that do the buy-in part and that don't encourage this sort of generous idea, right? And then we have a few that do. Runeterra is the one that comes to mind specifically. They were quite generous. It still wasn't just like, here's all the cards. It was like, yeah, you got to do some dailies and things to get them, but not that difficult to unlock all the cards with totally free to play. And Runeterra has failed. This might not be exactly why, but it was a contributing factor theoretically.
I think the developers have even come out and said that like that was something
part of it. Yeah, and again, it's that weird lineup that I'm talking about, right? Where like there's a synergy between these two things, and one, like it happens to be the best way to make money with a TCG and also be good for card distribution into the player base.
Well, and
which is weird. Like it feels weird and gross.
I think another good example of this is like looking at something like Artifact. In that when Artifact came out, they decided to have this minimum buy-in, whereas every other digital card game available, they went that free lead route, where it's like, okay, we want people to get in, start playing the game. We don't care if they stick around. We just need more eyeballs on this game and more fish to catch. Right, as they work their way down into that funnel to eventually buy packs or whatever their investment is. But Artifact said, no, we're going to do a $20 minimum buy-in. They're very generous when you pay the $20. They give you a lot of cards for doing that. However, it is a pretty steep buy-in for a game that's like comparable to competitors, and not a lot of people bought in.
Yeah,
it's tough to say if that's why.
It's again, I think it's a contributing factor.
Right.
Yeah, because Artifact itself is also like a pretty complicated game that I think was a little bit difficult for people to wrap their heads around. But I do think that the monetization model was also strange. So I don't know. Like part of it is we exist kind of in a different world now, right? Like there are these TCGs, Magic exists, all these other card games exist that have this sort of non-generous model, I suppose. That maybe this is part of disrupting that ecosystem, right? You come in and say, yeah, play this game. Here's the cards. Print them off. Play whatever you want. If you want to buy the cards, those are available, but you don't have to. You can just play the game. Whether that's a digital version of playing it or a print and play version or whatever it is.
It's a risky, I guess, sword to fall on, I suppose. But I do think that indie designers are in the best position to be able to do that, right?
Yeah. Well, and one of the things that I think has been good advice product design wise is that you can have a good idea, but you also need to think about like what your competition is going to do in response to what you're doing. And if you put yourself into a position where you're doing something that like your theoretical competition can't do, that's a good place for you to be. And I don't think a lot of established TCGs could say, here's the game for free.
Right. Here's the whole game for free. Imagine Magic suddenly saying, oh, Foundations, that set we're going to have till 2029, we're just going to make that like free, and you could just like
have it.
You just have it. Yeah.
That'd be crazy.
That would be crazy. So crazy. They probably won't do it.
They could though. Probably not.
I don't know.
Yeah, probably not.
Yeah. If you enjoyed listening to us ramble about proxies, please feel free to give us a little like and a subscribe, maybe a comment down below.
Yeah, let us know in the comments if you're pro proxy or not. I'm curious to see sort of different opinions on this situation. If you want to continue the discussion, you can also join our Discord. The link is in the description below. And thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.
Bye.